Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Dynasty Slant from PFF Fantasy. This is your host, Scott Spratt, joined, as always, by co-host Michael Moore. This is your place to be if you want to hear Michael's and my thoughts for Dynasty and Keeper Leagues. Michael, the big news of the week, especially here in Charlotte where I live, is that the Panthers are going up for sale. And seeing as that I'm an upstanding citizen of this fair city, I thought that maybe I should throw my hat into the ring. So any thoughts on how I can raise a quick $1 billion?
Well, none of it will be legal, Scott, and you just said how upstanding of a citizen you are, so we probably shouldn't go down that road. But
that is tough. You know. Maybe Diddy will let me co-own the team with him, or at least be his GM.
I mean, yeah, look, you've got a pretty decent resume. I think you should try it. You know, I mean, look, working at PFF opens a lot of doors, Scott. So
I definitely have more football and more, I guess, sports-related experience than Diddy and many other the people that went on the team. So.
I hope he doesn't hear this, Scott. I really
No, that's what I'm saying. We would be very complimentary with each other.
Oh, okay.
Diddy could bring the money, bring the style, bring the excitement, and frankly, I don't really know what I can bring. So why don't we just go ahead and get started with the show?
Yeah, okay.
Oh my God, it's picked up!
Topic 6.
Michael, we have another action-packed show with a lot of fun topics this week. And here is one that I think we've both been dying to talk about for a few weeks, but this fact that it's just been so quiet is sort of prevented us from doing it so far. Andrew Luck. His injury situation has really been a mystery so far this season. You know, last offseason, maybe about a full year ago, he had surgery to repair a torn labrum. And because it was so quiet, there was no news over the offseason, I think the fantasy community as a whole thought that he was going to be back playing, if not week 1, then sometime over the first couple of weeks of the season. Obviously, that hasn't happened, and we're starting to get some more details coming out about this whole situation. So forgive me for just kind of dumping a bunch of information before I could let you talk, Michael, but it's come out that when Luck started throwing in July, he experienced a setback where he was feeling pain that they're now calling biceps tendonitis. And so that sort of prevented him from playing this season. And over the last couple of months, he's been in Europe getting extended treatment and going through rehab there. And I'll have some more to say about that in a second. But since then, he's been going through that. Things are looking good. He's ramping up again to try to throw again in January. And we'll see how things go from there. But there's a lot of weird stuff going on here, Michael. There's a lot of medical issues up in the air. What are your thoughts on Luck as far as his value goes in dynasty formats at this point?
Man, I don't know how you can trust him at this point, you know, and I think we've been strung along so far that, you know, I don't know anyone that can trust that at that point, or at least trust him as a starter going into next season, no matter what the prognosis or no matter what the injury status is, just because this has knocked him out for this long. And furthermore, it's not like it's a lower body injury. This has to do with his upper body, which is kind of important to his whole...
his throwing arm. Yeah, you would want to have a good throwing arm.
Yeah, so it's kind of important to how valuable he is. So, you know, and don't get me wrong, I'm more conservative than other dynasty players, meaning I just get, I guess, skittish a lot easier than other people, but I wouldn't touch him, man, at least not as my starter. I don't know how you can trust him going in next year. What about you? I mean, you can't trust him as a starter, right?
I'm a bit of a mixed mind, Michael, because, you know, when I hear that people are going to Europe, if this sounds familiar to you, it's because you've probably heard about this before. There have been very famous athletes, including Kobe Bryant and Alex Rodriguez, that have gone to Europe or to Germany or somewhere in Europe, where they've then received what usually ends up being PRP injections, so the platelet-rich plasma injections. And I've kind of dug into what all the medical nonsense of all of this is. And as best I can tell at this point, it seems like there's a lot of work that's going on in Europe involving both blood manipulation and stem cell research that the FDA in America has harsher regulations on, and so the research is a little bit behind in America. So all of this stuff seems really cutting edge that's going on over there, and then you're seeing guys like Bryant come back and have a lot of success in their sport, and I'm like, hey, like maybe this is the cure-all that we really needed from Luck. But you know, I'm not really sure. It seems like they're already planning that if things go wrong in January, that they may have to do a corrective surgery to prepare his biceps tendon. So, like, that's not really what I want to hear in a shoulder injury. And there's just so much, like, pessimism that I would have in general because of shoulder injuries. I can get into that in a second. But, yeah, I'm getting very pessimistic, Michael.
Well, that, and let's not forget the team he plays for has been very oh God, what's the word? Very, I don't know, what would you call it? I don't want to say they've been lying, but they've been very
Mysterious?
yeah, they've been very mysterious about his injury status. I mean, and this goes back months. It's not like, this is anything new. I mean, we haven't gotten good intel on Andrew Luck in a very long time. I mean, look, people were still thinking he was going to start the season in the offseason, and that didn't happen. It didn't even get close. So, you combine the severity of the injury along with the team that he's playing for, which has just traditionally been very evasive, let's say, as far as injury news goes. Not just with him. We all remember the lost Peyton Manning year when he got injured too. So,
Right.
yeah, I'm just very skittish at this point. I mean, look, if you can obtain him for something cheap, not treating him like the starter he was, great. I think it's a good lottery ticket, but I wouldn't be relying on him for 2018 or beyond that.
I think I made a mistake when this injury first happened in assuming that everything was going to be fine, because the original injury was a torn labrum. Luck was playing through it for a while and was still putting up fantasy numbers. Obviously, he wasn't playing as well as he had at the peak of his career so far. But the player that always got thrown out as the comparison was, hey, Drew Brees had this injury, and guess what? Drew Brees is one of the best fantasy quarterbacks that's ever played. So I was like, oh, it's fine. But the more and more that I've researched labrum injuries, the more serious I've realized that this really is. And this kind of gets back to a little bit of my baseball experience too, because labrum injuries have been a lot more common in baseball because obviously a lot of people throw baseballs, so there's more pitchers in baseball than there are quarterbacks in football. And the research on labrum tears has been really bleak. So like the major piece of this came from Will Carroll, who wrote for Slate. He wrote a research article back in 2004 where he looked at 36 major league pitchers that tore their labrum, and only one in the previous 5 years leading into 2004 came back to their previous form or their previous quality of pitching. A lot of guys came back, they just weren't quite the same pitchers. And there's some really depressing names on the list of guys that failed to make it back over the years. Guys like Mark Pryor, Rob Nen, Ben Sheets, Brandon Webb. That may not mean a ton to the football fans, but these were like star players that their careers were just ended. And it's happened to a couple of the guys in football. I mean, Rich Gannon tore his labrum back in 2003, and he basically retired right after that. I mentioned Breeze, who recovered, but Matt Hasselbeck did it in 2007 and never reached his peak performance again. You had Mark Sanchez in 2013. His career wasn't exactly on the perfect footing before the injury, but he didn't really do much after that either. There have been a lot of guys that have been derailed by this injury over the years, and I wonder whether I wasn't treating it seriously enough when it initially happened, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, you said it all. I don't know what else there is to say other than until we get some proof that he's throwing without pain, and, he looks at least close to what he was before. I don't know how you can put any trust into him to be on, or to at least be an effective dynasty player next year.
This does get a little bit into just a theory on upside versus downside, though, because especially with the dynasty quarterbacks, there are a few guys at the top that are, I feel like, locked in where they are, but then it gets kind of murky to the point where you're wondering whether it's worth gambling on Luck, gambling that he can end up being the next Drew Brees rather than the next, Rob Nen or whoever. So let's break down some of the specific rankings and see what your thoughts are there. Again, I'm going to cite Scott Barrett's dynasty rankings because his are updated within the last couple of weeks. Would you take Luck over any of what I think are a pretty consensus top three, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, or Carson Wentz?
No, not even close.
I think those are pretty definitive too. What about Luck versus Deshaun Watson?
Nope.
Agreed. Watson's fourth in Scott's rankings. What about Luck versus Dak Prescott at 6?
Nope.
Okay, this is
I'm going to make this real easy for you, Scott.
Luck or Kirk Cousins at 8?
Nope.
Okay, I didn't dig nearly far enough. So maybe, Michael, you could just kind of suggest to me, who do you think is a comparable player in terms of dynasty value at the position?
Well, I don't know. Okay, so I'll look up some comparables to where I think he should be ranked. Let me say this, though. I don't think he should be ranked in the top 10 or as a quarterback 1. And as you alluded to, with dynasty leagues, and, every league's a little different as far as, how deep do you need a quarterback, and is it 2 quarterback league, stuff like that. But I will say this. Do I think he should be in the top 10 to 12, so essentially a starter? No, I don't. I think he should be outside of that. Now, I think he should be close to that because I think the upside is very good with him should he return to full health. But what I would much rather go with guys that at least are not, potentially permanently broken over Luck at this point.
So I think I disagree with you, and where I was kind of getting with the way that I grouped those guys when asking you who was better is I think there are those elite guys, the Wentzes and Rodgers, where you know you're getting that great production and you have a lot more confidence in their health. But when you get down to, say, the Dak Prescott, Kirk Cousins level of productivity, that's when I'm already ready to gamble on Luck. Because even though Luck has, I guess, a chance of never really being productive again, maybe not even playing again, and I hope that's not the case, his potential, if he comes back healthy, is much greater than those guys, and you would have a much longer window than those guys. I mean, I know that you like the fact that guys like Prescott and Cousins are relatively young and relatively healthy, but like how much better are they than some of the guys you can just kind of pick up off the waiver wire? You know, your Tyrod Taylors, your Josh McCowns of the world. In my mind, not hugely better. So I think you might trick yourself into thinking that because they're young and you would get them long term, they're really, really valuable, when in reality, they may only be giving you a little bit of production over the replacement level every season. Give me the chance with Luck that I'm going to have a guy that's a lot more valuable than the replacement level, even if there's a very real chance that you won't get anything at all from him.
Sure, and I will say this too. I think a lot of it will be determined by who is the coach there next year. And you know, I mean, obviously, when healthy, Luck is going to be their most valuable asset and who they should utilize the most. But you know, who knows who's going to be the coach that next year and what kind of game plan they're going to draw up. They may go the Jacksonville route for all we know and try to limit the exposure that Luck has out there, you know, and try to run the ball more. I don't know. But for me, I just, you know, and again, I fully admit to being a lot more skittish than other people, but to me, I just can't trust him right now.
Did you ever come up with a guy that you think is maybe a comparable value in your mind?
Well, if you're looking at those guys that are in that sort of 10 to 12 range, where I think Luck probably is, you've got guys like Stafford, you've got guys like maybe Brady and Breeze who are a bit on the older side. I mean, Jared Goff is still ranked fairly low. I would take, I think, Goff over Luck. What about you?
No, I would definitely take Luck over Goff.
Really? Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Rivers, I mean, he's kind of on the older side. Now you're getting the really deep ones like Tyrod, Andy Dalton, Ryan Tannehill. I would take Luck over all those guys. Don't get me wrong. But if it's Luck and Matt Ryan, I'm taking Matt Ryan. If it's Luck and Dak, I'm taking Dak. Stuff like that. Does that provide enough of a sort of a line for you?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, you think that Luck is the last of the like long-term assets that you would want to have in Dynasty, and then it starts to get into the replacement guys.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Well, I hope that you are too pessimistic because I'd love to see this guy back and playing. But you know, sometimes players get hurt.
And that's not to say in the offseason that if you know on your Dynasty teams that you shouldn't go out and get him for a good bargain. I totally agree with that because I do think the upside is very good, but. I'm just saying don't roll the dice that he's going to be the same Andrew Luck, at least not with the same confidence as you would before.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, topic number 2. Before they had their blowout loss on Sunday, Adam Schefter broke a story that Marvin Lewis plans to leave the Bengals at the end of the season when his current deal expires. Lewis has since denied that that is the case, but it kind of made me wonder with this whole thing up in the air, what do you think the Bengals are going to look like on offense next season, Michael?
Oof. I'm looking for a complete blow up, quite honestly. I don't think Andy Dalton is long for Cincinnati after this season. I know you've got his cap number, right? It's not that big if they cut him, right?
Yeah, so Dalton, if you remember when he signed his deal, it looked like one of those really big quarterback deals, but it was really more of the Colin Kaepernick style, where it was a year-to-year deal masquerading as a multi-year deal. So if the Bengals chose to cut Dalton this offseason, it would only be a $2.3 million cap hit for them, which is very minor. So if they don't think Dalton is good enough or not worthy of his, say, $13 or so million salary next season, they will cut him.
Yeah. So I don't see him lasting long. Now, that's not to say they're going to prefer A.J. McCarron. I don't know that they honestly don't go for a quarterback in the draft pretty high next year. For 2 reasons. 1, to sort of turn the page on the Dalton era, but 2, because it'll be cheaper than keeping Dalton around, I think. And I think probably cheaper than signing McCarron to anything short or long term. So I think there's going to be a new quarterback there. You know, they've got Joe Mixon at running back, who I think they'll probably still go with next year. He's young enough and he's cheap enough. AJ Green even, I mean, he's getting up there in age too. It wouldn't surprise me if they put him on the market for draft picks and completely started this rebuild. quite honestly. Not to mention their defense, which has always been pretty good, is also on the older side, between Dunlap and Burfict. So for me, I'm looking for them to completely blow it up. And I don't know that anyone is safe on that team next year.
Wow, if the Bengals traded AJ Green, it would be like a full-on Marlin situation in my mind. Who would go to those games at all?
But if there's any team to do it, it would be them. Can we agree on that?
Well, I guess because of where they are, then maybe that makes some sense. But I also wonder, too, like if Dalton isn't that good, which, I mean, I think you and I both agree that Dalton actually isn't that good of a quarterback, then maybe they aren't that far away from being decent again. Like, you just unload him, you can get a cheaper replacement in at quarterback. They could keep McCarron. McCarron is a restricted free agent this offseason, so they could give him a one-year deal and keep him in town and give him a tryout. Basically, that's what the Browns were planning to do before their trade fell through. So, like, maybe they just keep McCarron, let Dalton walk, see if it works out, draft a quarterback as well, and then just sort of let that be the transition. I feel like if they did that, they do have some talent on the team. Maybe they could actually be a Jets level competitive team, trying to get it to 500 or maybe winning a division that may not be as strong next season in the North.
Sure. Oh, and I don't disagree. They've got good young assets. I just think they're going to go with the younger assets as opposed to the veteran assets, whether it's Green or Dalton. Look, Green's going to be 30 next year, which not to say he's going to decline rapidly next year. But again, if it could get them out of the salary, which he makes a pretty good salary, then I think they would prefer to do that and start over. I mean, they've got good young guys. They've got Mixon. They've got John Ross, which, look, this season has been a complete bust for him, I will grant you. But that's not to say he couldn't come back next year. Even, at tight end, they've got Tyler Kroft, who's only 25, who's played decent since Tyler Eifert's been out indefinitely. So I don't know. I look for that team to just hit the reset button and a lot of new faces starting next year.
I wonder then where Dalton would end up in fantasy. I mean, we've kind of had this discussion with some of the other guys, like if Kirk Cousins leaves, who goes where? Is there a team that you think would be eager to bring Dalton in to be their guy?
I think he probably faces the same fate maybe of a Cutler or something like that, where maybe there's some backup options in the offseason, or maybe even some jobs he'll compete for. I don't think there'll be any team that guarantees him the starting job, but I think there'll be plenty of teams that, whether through injury or maybe they've drafted a young quarterback that they want to bridge. I think Dalton's at that place in his career at this point. I think he is what he is. He's not going to get much better than this. And look, I don't expect the Bengals to want to pay for league average, which is what Dalton is at best. I think somebody will use him, as some backup or some mentor role, but that'll be about the end of it.
I could see a team like either the Redskins or Jaguars bringing him in because, like, if they don't want to pay their guy, like if they don't think Cousins is a $100 million quarterback or Bortles is a whatever he's going to command dollar quarterback, maybe you could get Dalton on the cheap because, if the Bengals don't retain him, I definitely feel like the shine is worn off or whatever that phrase is over the years. So maybe you could get Dalton on like a one-year prove-it deal and try to use him as the bridge, like you suggest. So
yeah, I mean I'm curious to see what the Jets do, quite honestly, with McCown and in the draft. If they draft one, does McCown go somewhere else for a better deal? I mean, look, he's played decent.
McCown had a good year.
He did. I mean,
yeah.
You've got the Broncos. They're perpetually looking for a quarterback solution there. Look, even maybe the Colts, quite honestly, depending on what happens with Luck. We just got done talking about them. I'm going through the teams. No, that's probably about it as far as any teams with a glaring need going into next year. But I think the days of Andy Dalton starting all 16 games for a team are over.
So I mentioned the Jaguars a second ago, and I wanted to bring them up as our third topic because first, they clinched their first playoff berth in a decade, so congrats to them. Nice 45-7 win over the Texans. But the thing that was super weird about that game was because Leonard Fournette was out and because Marquise Lee got hurt early in the game, there were some surprising guys that sort of became the stars of the game, the two most prominent being Keelan Cole with 7 catches for 186 yards and 1 touchdown, and Jadon Mickens with 4 catches for 61 yards and 2 touchdowns. So I know it was kind of a weird circumstance, Michael, but I wanted to ask you whether you thought either of these guys was worth looking at in dynasty formats.
Well, let's talk about Cole first. He was somebody that was on the radar of rookie drafters in the offseason. I mean, he was a deep he was a deep prospect. Don't get me wrong, but
Yeah.
he was a guy that looked good coming out of college. There was a lot of depth in Jacksonville, which I think probably turned some people off at first, at least in the beginning of the season with Robinson. You had Alan Hearns, who was a holdover. And then, of course, they drafted Dede Westbrook, who was also blocking that, and Marquise Lee, who came on late last year. So I think Cole was overlooked just because there wasn't a lot of opportunity, at least obvious opportunity. But obviously that opened up this season when you had Robinson go down with a knee injury. You had Alan Hearns, who's been banged up for most of the season. And then you had, injuries to guys like Lee and guys like Westbrook that kind of opened the door for Cole. And look, now Cole is probably been their best receiver this year, wouldn't you say? At least the last couple of games he has been.
I think he's been their best receiver overall, and the number that I would point to is his 10.5 yards per attempt. Over the last couple of years, that's number one on the team. And if you throw out Mickens, number two on the team is Marquise Lee at 8.1 yards per attempt. So, 2.5 more yards. That's a really big deal. And Cole is definitely that kind of field stretcher with a 14.1 yard average depth of target. That's kind of what he did in this game, and I feel like that's a skill that he can bring to the table that most of the other guys on the roster can't. So, yeah, I definitely like him. Mickens is the guy that I think was totally off my radar. There have been some really
he was
cool
off everyone's radar, Scott. Don't feel bad.
Sure, yeah. There have been some really cool stories about him because of this game where actually earlier this year he was living in his car because I guess he had been cut by the Raiders, and so he was on the Jaguars practice squad, not sure whether he was going to last a week, never mind a month, to get like a lease. So he was literally living in his car. But he's kind of made his way to be a punt returner for the team, and because Alan Hearns was hurt, and Larry Pinkard, another guy on their depth chart, was hurt. They were inactive entering the game. Lee got hurt in the game. They only really had, I think, Dede Westbrook, Cole, and then Mickens active at wide receiver for the game. So I think that's kind of how he found his way into the mix right now. I'm not sure I'm ready to consider him worth owning or looking at in Dynasty because he's a very small guy. I think punt returner is probably where he fits in the league. Is that sort of where you see his value too?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, he's definitely on the small side. He's under 6 foot. He's like 170, 180 pounds. So, I can't see him developing into anything more than what he is now. I mean, to his credit, he's done well in very limited playing time. Yeah. He's only got 7 targets on the season, but his wide receiver rating, which is the quarterback rating when the quarterback throws to him, is second in the entire league amongst receivers, if you counted every single receiver. So he's been good, but again, I would have to see more from him before I took him seriously. But a guy like Cole, who has been thrown into the starting lineup and seen significant action, personally, I think there is something there. I think in an ideal scenario, Jacksonville goes next year with a 3-receiver set of something like Robinson, Cole, and Westbrook. I think they probably cut Hearns. He's just going to cost too much and isn't worth it. I think Marquise Lee probably moves on to greener pastures in free agency. But I think Cole probably, I think he sticks around. And like you said, he's been a very good deep threat. I mean, a quarter of his targets all season have been of the deep variety, meaning 20 yards or more, and he's converting them. So, yeah, I think there's something there, and I think he's probably a guy to watch.
I've queued up some similar deep type of threats to do a comparison here for you with rankings. So do you prefer Cole or J.J. Nelson, who's the number 82 receiver in Scott Barrett's rankings?
I would go Cole, I think, at this point. I mean, Cole, and again, he hasn't played or been in the league nearly as much as Nelson has, but he seems to have been a little more consistent than Nelson, so I would go Cole at this point.
What about Cole or Curtis Samuel?
I would probably lean towards Samuel at this point, and given he's obviously seen the same, he entered the league the same year as Cole did, which was this year. Obviously got sidelined by the injury, so we're not going to see nearly as much of him. And I just think they're probably setting Samuel up a little more than they are Cole in Jacksonville. But I would give it to Samuel, I think, by a hair at this point.
Samuel is 63rd in Scott Barrett's rankings. One last guy, I think I know the answer to this, Cole or Tyler Lockett?
Oh, man. Are we still trying to make Tyler Lockett a thing? Or is that still a thing that we're trying to do?
I haven't specifically looked it up, but I think his fantasy season's been a little bit better than you expect because the Seahawks are just passing it so much more now than they ever did before.
Yeah, that's true. But I don't know. I personally would probably go I'd probably go Cole and Samuel, I think, over Lockett at this point, which, look, that pains me to say because I really liked Lockett going into the season, but for whatever reason, he just hasn't, I guess, busted out nearly as much as we thought he would. Now you've got the emergence of Paul Richardson in Seattle, which is kind of blocking any chance Tyler Lockett has. So I would give it to Cole in that scenario, I think.
Okay, Scott Barrett's got it a little bit differently organized. He's got Lockett at 51st, the highest of those guys. So it sounds like you probably have him sort of in the 50 to 60 range, Cole, I mean.
I would say that, yeah.
And he's actually a player that I think makes some sense to try to acquire right now because you mentioned that Lee could be moving on. He's a free agent after this season. Allen Robinson is also a free agent after this season, so we don't know what the Jags do. I feel like there has to be some chance that he ends up with one of the starting outside spots this offseason, so I kind of want to ride that out and see what happens with Cole. His value could go way up if that is the case, and even if not, I like the talent, so I want to give him a chance to do something in the long term. All right, Michael, here's going to be your favorite topic of the week. Actually, we're going to have to create some sound for this because it seems like every week we're going to have a Jimmy Garoppolo section.
It's going to be a regular thing. It has to be at this point.
He's so good and so beautiful. I don't know how we can stop. But anyway, he's delivered his third victory in his 3 starts with the 49ers this week. This one was really cool because it included a game-winning drive against the Titans, who actually are competing for the playoffs, so that was a really big win. Garoppolo hasn't thrown a ton of touchdowns in those wins, but he's thrown for 293, 334, and 381 yards in those 3 games. So it seems like he's going to be a guy, like one of the fantasy quarterbacks that you're going to want to own, especially in dynasty formats. So I guess I wanted to ask you, because we've already covered that angle, are there any 49er skill players that you think that Garoppolo is going to carry to fantasy success in the future?
Well, I would say as far as the current roster goes, I would say no. Now, let me say this. I think the running back position in Shanahan's offense will be valuable.
Yeah.
I just don't know if it's going to be Hyde or somebody like Barkley in the draft this year or someone else. But no matter where Shanahan goes, at least when he was an offensive coordinator, that position was extremely valuable, whether it was Arian Foster in Houston, whether it was Devontae Freeman last year in Atlanta. So I think the running back position there will be valuable. As far as receiver goes, I know that Marquise Goodwin's put up some good numbers. Pierre Garçon has always been reliable, and he probably would be this year if not for the injury. I still think the 49ers would like to sign another stud receiver. I think they want to keep Garçon, and I think they want to keep Goodwin, but I think they really need that kind of Julio Jones, big, fast, all-in-one kind of prototypical receiver, if you will, to round out that offense there. So I don't know that that person is on the roster yet, but I definitely think the positions under Shanahan and Garoppolo are there for it.
I'm not sure I disagree, but I do want to point out that in those 3 games that Garoppolo has played so well, Goodwin has 24 receptions on 32 targets, 319 yards, which gives him the 3rd most yards in football behind just Tyreek Hill and Antonio Brown over that stretch. So, I mean, that is very productive. And Goodwin is in a 2-year deal. I think the 49ers could cut him for a small cap if they wanted to, but I don't see why they would. He's playing really well. So I feel like Goodwin could be a really part of this team. But given that Garçon has been out and that he'll be back again next year too, I think those two probably end up splitting it up too much to make either one of them, say, even a wide receiver 2. Maybe one of the two of them's in the flex range, but I think I agree with you there. Question for you too, though. Like Scott Barrett has George Kittle, the tight end, ranked 20th at the position in Dynasty. Is he maybe the guy that could be something for Dynasty players?
I'm torn on that. And when you look at, and again, I go back to Kyle Shanahan's history. He's got a mixed history when it comes to tight ends. So when he was in Houston, obviously you had Owen Daniels, for those of you that have been playing that long, who was an extremely valuable fantasy and dynasty asset. But then you go to, say, Atlanta last year, and no tight end on the Falcons was worth anything as far as fantasy goes. I think, I'm looking it up. I mean, the most targets that a tight end had last year in Atlanta with Shanahan was Jacob Tamme with 31, which isn't great. And even the guys behind him, Austin Hooper had 27, Levine Toilolo had 19. So, even combined, it wasn't exactly tight end 1 material. So personally, I'd keep Kittle there in that range. I would like to see more attention devoted to the position before I move that up. But look, I think the possibilities are very good that the running backs and the receivers there can produce. I don't know if they'll be, I don't know if the highs there will be as high as Shanahan's gotten before, but it's definitely possible with Shanahan. And with a guy like Garoppolo, who at the very least is not turning the ball over nearly as much as some previous 49er quarterbacks have been doing. So as long as he can hold on to the ball and keep moving the field or keep moving the ball down the field, you're going to have a shot on that.
I don't think Garoppolo needs to have any top end fantasy player, be it a receiver, tight end, or whatever, in order to be very productive himself in fantasy. He can just kind of spread it around and make that work, which, good news and bad news, I guess, for fantasy owners. Okay, Michael, topic number 5. The Rams had another big win, too, this weekend with a 42-7 win over the Seahawks, which pretty much locked them into the playoffs. But Todd Gurley pretty much took all the fantasy points for himself, and I hope that you didn't have to face him in any of your playoffs this week because, yeah. I thought that it was kind of an interesting note that Sammy Watkins didn't really do much here and has 3 or fewer catches and 40 or fewer yards in each of those previous 3 games, although he scored twice in that stretch, too. I don't really know what to think about Watkins. Do you think Watkins has sort of proven himself to be a good receiver and maybe be a part of the long-term future and what looks like a very attractive situation now in LA? Or do you think Watkins is going to be moving on? What are your thoughts about him in dynasty formats at this point?
Well, and look, he's been so frustrating. and look, let's not forget. I mean, it's not just this year that's been disappointing. His usage in Buffalo wasn't as much as we all hoped it would be either. And I think we all were hoping for a change, or we were hoping a change of scenery would do him some good this year in LA, but it really hasn't. I mean, he's still only 3rd on the team in targets, or rather 4th on the team if you count Todd Gurley. He's well behind Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp in that regard. And look, it looks like the Rams don't need him, quite honestly. They've been going to Kupp and Woods, and obviously you've got Todd Gurley in the backfield. So, look, I think it's pretty obvious that if you want Sammy Watkins to be the wide receiver 1 that he was drafted to be, that we all thought he would be, it has to be somewhere else other than Los Angeles. Because if he stays there, I can't see him being anything more than a decoy at this point. And look, he's a very good decoy. He can create some mismatches. There's no doubt about it. But if he's going to be your wide receiver 1, he's got to go somewhere where he sees 100 targets a year. And he's just not getting that here.
I think it's a little harsh to call him a decoy. What I think he is a deep threat. And I think this is a role that he can play very well, but it's more of a role player type of role than what he had in his first few years in Buffalo. And this is actually, it really reminds me of Torrey Smith's career. So that'll probably ring some bells for you being a 49ers fan. But early in Smith's career, he was sort of forced to be the guy in Baltimore because they didn't really have anyone else at the position. But he was a bit underqualified to be a true number 1 receiver because he can't really run the diversity of routes to sort of make that happen. And I know Watkins was a high pick in the draft back in his day, but I don't think that's the thing for Watkins either. I think he really makes more sense when he's sort of playing to his strengths, mostly as a deep threat. So even if Watkins ends up moving on from LA, I'm not really sure he's ever going to recapture his status as being a number 1 receiver in that sense for a team. So, I guess that's bad news for fantasy owners. He may end up having more seasons where he scores 10 touchdowns, but I think the days of him getting 70 or more target catches a season are probably behind him. So, yeah, maybe a flex consideration at best, but not someone that I'm dying to own in dynasty formats. Is that sort of what you think too?
Yeah, I mean, unless he moves on again, and there's another team with a glaring need for a receiver that is in the top half of the league of pass attempts, I'm staying away from that one.
Okay. All right, the last of the topic 6 for today, Michael, is one you suggested and one that I'm stunned that we haven't talked about yet. But it's Alex Collins, running back for the Ravens. This guy may be my favorite player in the league. He's really established himself as being an excellent player over the last couple of months. He had a relatively poor day on Sunday with just 19 yards on the ground. He did have 33 yards receiving. But in my mind, one bad day doesn't really diminish what Collins is doing. Michael, what do you think about Collins as a longer-term asset and not just for this year?
Well, I think, we're both in agreement. We really like him. It was kind of interesting, too, because he was in Seattle. That's where he started his career and was kind of part of that logjam at running back that they had last year. He saw some time there, too, but apparently it wasn't good enough for them, so he got released. I think he actually spent some time on the Jets or some other team before he eventually signed on with Baltimore after they needed a running back because of the Kenneth Dixon injury. But I love him. I really hope he stays in Baltimore. I really hope they give him a chance to be the starter again next year, because he's been by far probably their brightest spot on offense this season. He's averaging 5 yards a carry, which is in itself pretty impressive, especially when you consider the backs behind him haven't gotten above 3.5 with Terrence West and Buck Allen. And, even in the passing game, he was doing well with that too when he was sort of doing double duty. So it's all tied to me on if he stays in Baltimore, because if he does, I think he will also be I think he'll be good again next year.
It's been a slow progression because at the beginning of the year, obviously, he wasn't even on the main team. But then starting in week 5, he's gotten at least 10 carries every week. And then over the last 5 weeks, he's been getting at least 2 receptions every week and has been a big part of their screen game. And he's been excellent at everything they've asked him to do, even as his role has expanded. He even has 5 touchdowns over the last 5 weeks, something that he wasn't doing earlier in the season. But I've been very impressed, and all of his stats look super good. He's 10th among the 39 backs in the league with at least 100-plus carries, with 3.0 yards after contact per attempt. You mentioned that he's got 4.9 yards per carry for the season. That's 4th among those backs with 100-plus carries. In my mind, he's not just the best offensive player they have on the Ravens. I think he's one of the best backs in the league. It kind of came a little later, came out of nowhere being a former 5th-round pick, but I think he's a true 3-down back that's going to be one of the best running backs in the league for the next few seasons.
Oh, yeah. Well, and another stat, he's 4th in elusive rating, too.
Yeah.
Amongst all running backs. I mean, he's forced 31
fast.
Shockingly fast. He's forced 31 missed tackles on just 174 rushes, and he's even forced 10 missed tackles on his 18 receptions, which is amazing. I mean, and it's also funny to me that Seattle, who has sort of been desperate to find some solution to their running game ever since Marshawn Lynch retired, seemingly had a solution and they just let him go, because I'm sure they would kill to have Alex Collins back in Seattle doing what he's doing in Baltimore with them. But alas, it was not meant to be.
That's true. There were some things that I think made that easy for them to do to make that mistake, if that's what it is. Well, one, he fumbled a lot very early in his career, but he kind of did the Tiki Barber move where he started tucking the ball much higher at kind of a 45-degree angle up toward his chest, and the fumble problems seem to have gone away over the last couple of months since he's made that switch. The other thing that's kind of quirky about this is that he actually suffers from migraines. That's actually why he wears the visor, which I think the visor is super cool and intimidating, so I think more backs should wear it. But did the migraines scare you off? I only really remember this happening with Percy Harvin, and it actually was an issue for fantasy players because of the uncertainty from time to time. Does it scare you with Collins? At this point it doesn't, and maybe that's because the shelf life of a running back is short in general. Yeah. So to me, it's just one of the inherent risks that you're going to have with him. But because again, with running backs, you're not going to have a lot of years with them anyway, as far as dynasty leagues go. So I'm buying at this point. Scott Barrett has him ranked 37th among his dynasty backs. Keep in mind, this was a couple of weeks ago. That could have gone up. And this is also related to the fact that he doesn't have a contract next season. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. I still think that's way, way too low. So let me ask you some guys to get you to see if you're as bullish as I am. Do you prefer Collins or Rex Burkhead in dynasty?
I would go Collins. I think,
okay.
You alluded to this before. Collins has definitely got the makeup of a 3-down back, and there's definitely potential there for that. So I would go with that.
Burkhead is 31st in Scott's rankings. Alex Collins or Aaron Jones of the Packers?
Oh, man. I don't know that I would take Alex Collins, or I don't know that I would take any Packers running back over Alex Collins at this point. It's just, to me, that's still a team in a position that isn't settled, at least long-term or even short-term, quite honestly. So I would still take Collins at that point.
Aaron Jones is 26th in Scott's rankings. And then finally, Collins or your guy, Carlos Hyde, who's a free agent after this season.
I would still go Hyde at that point. I think Hyde has a longer track record of being more of a featured back. And look, he's had a really good season too. So I would still go Hyde at that point.
I would actually go Collins there, and I think it's about the youth. They both have kind of similar usage this season, but the fact that he's younger, I think it's going to give him a longer window of success in the future. Okay. In my mind, I think Collins is a running back 1 in Dynasty. I mean, I know that sounds really weird, but that's
very bullish of you, Scott. Very bullish.
That's where I see him right now. So get in on Collins while you can is sort of my idea. All right, so I think that'll do it for the topic. So let's jump on over to some Gunpoint Banner, Michael.
Guys.
Gunpoint banter.
All right, we talked about this a little bit in that previous running back ranking with Collins. With the Patriots backfield, obviously that's a thing that's always super confusing for fantasy players. That's going to make this, I think, a fun gunpoint banner. So, Michael, which of the Patriots backs would you most want to own in a dynasty format?
Instead of James White, who I originally said, I think I'm going to go with Rex Burkhead, actually. So the reason for that is, obviously, James White, his MO and really his use in the Patriots backfield is as the receiving back. But his targets have gone down pretty significantly, at least on the last half of the season. So he was seeing 6.5 targets through the first half of the season, through the first 8 games. But since then, he's only seen about 3 targets a game. Meanwhile, you got Rex Burkhead, who's also seeing the same amount of targets per game at 3. But he's got 3 games of double-digit carries, whereas James White has 1 game of double-digit carries all season. And I think just on an efficiency basis, Burkhead's been the better back, at least between him and White. So Burkhead's yards per route run, according to PFF, is second amongst all running backs with at least 24 targets, which is 52 running backs. Whereas James White is much lower on that list. I think his was at 1.89, and Rex Burkhead's was maybe 2.5, something like that. But point is, Rex Burkhead was a lot more efficient and effective in the running game or in the passing game, and was seeing just as many targets. So for all that and more, I would be going with Rex Burkhead at this point.
I'm actually glad you made the switch to Burkhead because that's who I thought you were going to pick originally, and kind of why I thought this topic would make sense in the end anyway. Because Burkhead has kind of had all of the touchdowns of a good fantasy player in recent weeks, where he's been getting all of the goal line work for the Patriots and also getting a number of targets. So that kind of stuff is pointing to his versatility. But the more that I dig into the numbers, the more that I come to the conclusion that Lewis is actually the most versatile back on the team. And I think it sort of stands out when you look at his efficiency numbers. Number one being that Lewis has 5.2 yards per attempt this season, which I think is number one of all running backs. He's even got 3.5 yards after contact per attempt. Burkhead's at 2.0, so nearly twice as good. Lewis is definitely the smaller player, 195 pounds compared to 215 for Burkhead. But I think Lewis is actually the most effective runner between the tackles on the team. And I think it's just because Lewis is such a versatile player, he can do so many different things, that it makes it difficult for teams to, stack the box against them, assuming run, because he can be used equally effectively as a receiver or as a runner. So I think that versatility is going to kind of keep him in the mix long term. He doesn't have tons of touchdowns the way that Burkhead does, but he has been the number 11 fantasy back in standard scoring since week 6, which is kind of the point in the season when he got healthy. So the upside may not be number 1 type running back in the league, which I guess Burkhead probably could do, but I think Lewis is going to be a very effective running back too for the next several seasons.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree with that. And look, like we've talked about before, the Patriot running backs, it's truly a guessing game no matter who you're talking about, because they seem to bring in new guys every single year and just kind of mix and match. But look, at the very least, they know how to pick them. I mean, they've all been very good and very efficient. There hasn't been one glaring, I think, disappointment there. So, and look, all of them are signed for a couple years. All of them are fairly cheap. So it's not as if any one of them is going to be an obvious cap casualty. So, yeah, and look, if Lewis has truly won sort of the first and second down role that LeGarrette Blount had last year when he scored so many touchdowns, then, hey, that's a valuable position too. So I could see that. Again, it's kind of like pick your poison with them and don't rely too much on it.
All right, then let's close this thing up with the stash of the week.
I'm telling you, these shares are hot. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. It's definitely a good idea. Dwayne, I get it. Now, can you get me? Have I ever lied to you? That's right. And ask around. I never do, Dwayne.
Stash of the week.
All right, Michael, who do you have as your stash of the week this week?
Well, mine is going to be Chad Williams, receiver from Arizona. He was a third-round pick this year. Hasn't seen a lot of action this year just because the receiver depth chart in Arizona is pretty full. But he's got the talent. He originally played at LSU, but had some off-field issues. So he transferred to Grambling, where he proceeded to lead the conference in receptions, yards, and touchdowns. So he's got the talent. Got drafted in the third round. Again, more of a prospect, more of a project there. But with the Cardinals receivers, a couple of them becoming free agents this offseason, between John Brown, between Jaron Brown, I think there's going to be an opening for some targets next year. And look, there's still Larry Fitzgerald, who will be a great mentor for him, and there's really probably nobody better to learn from at the position. But talent-wise, I think he's very good, and I think he's a good stash.
I am really curious to see how the Cardinals wide receiving corps shakes out over the offseason. It just seems like there's a lot of potential in the future for some turnover there. So I think that's a really, really smart pick. All right, with my stash of the week, I'm going to go with a guy that's a little bit better known than the guys I normally select, but who may have become available in your Dynasty formats over the last year or so. And that's Teddy Bridgewater, quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. So Michael and I talked about Bridgewater and the Vikings as a whole a couple of weeks ago and mentioned that all three of their quarterbacks right now are free agents after this season. I have to think and hope that Case Keenum has sort of made the case that he deserves to be their guy in the future. So I think that's going to be the one they target to bring in to be their starter again next season. But that said, I think Bridgewater can be a player next year that a team will give a shot to maybe become the starter if he can win a battle in camp or whatever. So he actually made it back onto the field for the first time since 2015 this week. So that was good to see. For his career, he's got a 64.7% completion percentage and 7.2 yards per attempt. So that's pretty decent. I think the one thing that people used to criticize him about was that he didn't go down the field enough. But when he did go down the field, he completed 34.8% of those deep passes. That's pretty much middle of the pack with guys like Ben Roethlisberger, Matthew Stafford, and Phillip Rivers. So good enough when he tries. I wonder if his conservative nature was more about just the offense in general. Maybe give him a chance to open it up a little bit more with a different team, with a different style. I think he could maybe be successful with that. So I'd love to see Bridgewater get a shot with another team next year and see if he can, maybe recapture. At one time, people thought he was going to be one of the up-and-coming quarterbacks to own. So if he's available in your Dynasty format, I would give him a look. I think he might end up with a job next season and surprise some people. Michael, do you think that there's any chance of that happening?
I think so. And honestly, I think he's the leader at this point to be the Vikings quarterback next season. Personally, I think they probably will not. I think Case Keenum will find a starting job somewhere else. But look, they've stuck with Teddy Bridgewater this long. They obviously, he was their starter before this very bad injury. So it's not like he's going to have to prove himself again. But I'm very good with it. And look, as we've seen, the Vikings quarterback position can be valuable from a fantasy standpoint. So no, I think it's a very good lottery ticket at this point.
Okay, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Dynasty Slant. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and thank you for subscribing. We're part of the PFF Specialty Fantasy Podcasts that include the IDP and DFS shows. Both of those are really good listens, so check all of those out and subscribe to all three of our podcasts together. A little bit of housekeeping. I'll note that next week is Christmas, so Michael and I are going to skip next week for the holidays, and we'll probably be back then near the start of January. And so we'll be looking forward to the playoffs and some more great Dynasty content over the offseason. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you guys in 2 weeks.